Let's do one more example. Let's do number 7. Your car tire shows a pressure of 35 psi. What is the pressure in millimeters of mercury inside the tire? So right away we know we're dealing with psi and millimeters of mercury. So we need a relationship between those two units to convert between the two of them. So let's figure out what that is. So we know up here 14.7 psi is equal to 760 millimeters of mercury. So let's use that and write a for every statement. So we can say for every 14.7 psi, there are 760 millimeters of mercury. Now, when you write this kind of statement, you're kind of wondering, like, all right, well, what does 14.7 and 760 get me? Those numbers are just hard to look at. It's not like the nice 1 atmosphere is the same as 760 millimeters of mercury. But we can do some division and compare these two numbers. Dividing means comparing. And we can compare these two numbers using division. We can get ourselves a 1 to something relationship. So let's do that. Here's 14.7 divided by 760. What do we get? 0.019. So what that says is, I'm going to write this over here, 14.7 divided by 760 equals 0.019. So if we think about this in terms of units, this is psi and this is millimeters of mercury. Well, this units of this number over here would be psi over millimeters of mercury. And that's just basically saying for every 1 millimeter of mercury I have, because you could rewrite this 0.019 as 0.019 over 1. That's the same thing. Anything divided by 1 is itself. 0.019 psi for every 1 millimeter of mercury, or for every 1 millimeter of mercury I have 0.019 psi. Okay, cool. How's that help us? Well, we can write that as a for every statement, and you can say for every 0.019 psi, there are 1 millimeter of mercury. And then we got this 35, and then question mark. We're asking, how many millimeters of mercury do we have if we have 35 psi? Well, this doesn't jump out at me as being immediately useful. And that doesn't mean it's not. And some of you might see math you can do there. But let's flip this over and kind of rewrite this sentence and see if we can get something that's just easier to look at. And that's just another way to try it. So we can say for every 760 millimeters of mercury, there are 14.7 psi. And you can just flip this division and do 760 over 14.7. So what's that equal? 760 divided by 14.7. That gives us 51.7 psi. Oops, I did that backwards, didn't I? Millimeters of mercury over psi. So this is actually 51.7 millimeters of mercury over psi. Or for every 1 psi, I get 51.7 millimeters of mercury. Hey, that sounds more useful for solving our problem. So let's do that. let's write this as a for every statement. For every 1 psi, there are 51.7 millimeters of mercury. So cool, we just wrote ourselves a nice, easy statement that helps us convert this unit to that unit in this case. So let's rewrite our problem. For every 35 psi, there are some number, question mark, millimeters of mercury. So here's our relationship. Here's our fact. 1 psi, you got to multiply by 51.7 to get here. So we can multiply 35 times 51.7 and get millimeters of mercury. Let's try that. (51.7) times 35 gives us 1,809.5 millimeters of mercury. Another way to get there, I think, we can do 1 times 35. So 1 times 35 gives you 35. Well, what if you do 51.7 times 35? Oh, hey, that's what we already did. 51.7 times 35 is the same as 51.7 times 35. See how the math kind of works out? What we're actually doing here is solving a proportion. And I don't care if you've never understood what a proportion is, but that's what you're really doing here. And let's think if our 1,805 number makes sense. Well, 1,809 is like some amount more than double 760. Like double 760 would be, like, let's just think about that. 760 times 2. I'm just thinking 700 times 2 is 1,400. About 1,520. So we're a little bit more than double. Well, that makes sense too, right? 35 is a little bit more than double 14.7. So that kind of makes sense, but we're on the right track. It's another way to check just to make sure things make sense. But here is our answer for that one. So your car tire pressure in this case is 1,809.5 millimeters of mercury. And you can set up these for every statements to do any of these. And some of you, if you can solve proportions, you'll start to see the relationships in the math here, and I think you'll find these relationships here easy to use.